And I looked, 1991, I was a lieutenant colonel working for Carl Vono in his little assessments and initiatives group. And Marty Dempsey was just about a month away from taking command of 467 Armor. And what I took from that was there is some poor lieutenant colonel out there who doesn't know it, but he's in line to be the next chief of staff of the Army in about 20 years. And now there's probably about 30 other ones out there that think they're going to be, but the guy who's really going to be has no clue. The other thing I just say here, just to let you know, I'm heading back quickly here to begin the retirement festivities for Ken Preston. And Ken has been an absolutely magnificent Sergeant Major of the Army. He's been our longest serving Sergeant Major of the Army, 7 years plus, and he'll retire Wednesday with about 36 years in service. And he's made a huge impact on our non-commissioned officer corps, which you all know is head and shoulders the best in the world, maybe our best ever. And we've got Ray Chandler coming in to replace him, and we'll swear him in that same afternoon, and we'll be off and running again. But great non-commissioned officers. Now, as I thought about what I'd say to you here, knowing that the only thing standing between me and the door is 5 posture hearings, I thought I'd try to be a little reflective and to kind of put this point in time in perspective. And it strikes me that we, the Army, is at a key transition point, not just because we're changing chiefs, but because of where we are. And we are coming out of a decade at war where we have fundamentally transformed the Army, and we're entering a period of continued war and, frankly, great uncertainty both at the strategic and in the fiscal level. And we have fought very hard to restore balance to this force over the last 5 to 6 years. And I think the key transition is going to be, we're about there. But how do we sustain that balance and continue to build a balanced Army in a period of constrained resources? And I think that's the transition that faces us, and that's the one that I'd like to talk about. I mean, you think about it. We're emerging from a decade at war with a well-equipped, combat-seasoned, total force. But that force is still stretched by our significant accomplishments of the last decade. And we're facing a continued war in an era of persistent conflict where the resources available to us are only going to be reduced. Now let me go back and talk about where we've been in the last 5 or 6 years and how that sets us up to step off into the next decade of the 20th century. You've been hearing me rail on now for 4 years that the Army was out of balance, that we're so weighed down by the current demands that we can't do the things that we know we need to do to sustain the all-volunteer force and to restore strategic flexibility to do the things we know we need to do. And we have been working very hard across the Army to restore balance by the end of this year. And I can tell you, we will largely meet the objectives we set out for ourselves in 2007 by the end of this year. And we will be in a much, much better place as an Army than we were 4 years ago. Let me just tick off a couple of things. Growth. We finished the growth that President Bush instructed us to do in 2007 in 2009. And as I look back and say, what are some of the things I'm most thankful I did? And that first thing is to get Secretary Gates' support to accelerate the growth of the Army. You may recall, originally it was supposed to be done next year. Do you think we would have finished that if we hadn't got it done sooner? And the second piece of the growth was the temporary end strength increase. That has allowed us to continue to field appropriately manned units and still deal with the large number of non-deployables and folks that are already deployed in other jobs. And that 22,000 increase, we actually reached that point a couple of months ago. And that has enabled us to field 120,000 soldiers without stop loss. And I looked at a chart coming down here. As of the end of January, we had just over 500 soldiers across the Army stop loss. That's down from thousands. And all the personnel folks that are here, I can see Pat Hickerson sitting down in the front row. She knows what a traumatic experience that was for the personnel community. But we're there, and we're much better postured to continually field train ready forces because of that. Dwell. Because of that growth and because of the fact we got it done 3 years ahead of time, and because of the drawdown in Iraq, we're actually starting the 1st of October this year. Soldiers deploying after that can expect to deploy and have 2 years at home when they get back. That is a huge step. It's someplace we had to go. All of our studies tell us that it takes 24 to 36 months to recover from a 1-year combat deployment. It just does. We're human. And we had to get there. And once we're there, we need to hold ourselves to that. And I've already written Secretary Gates a note saying that the Global Force Management Allocation Plan for 12, for this next fiscal year, actually allows us to meet expected demand at an acceptable deployment tempo for our soldiers. First time in over 5 years. And I ask for his support to hold us to that. Because this plan is built on known demands, and as you know, we always get the unexpected. But much, much better place on dwell. Organizational change. Between the modularization of the Army and the rebalancing of skills away from our Cold War skills over the last 7 years, we have fielded a fundamentally different Army, and an Army that is much more suited to the challenges of the 21st century. And I'm extremely pleased with that. And as you know, you never stop changing, and there's no end to good ideas, especially when you're at war. And the intellectual effort underneath that underpinned that transformation that we just made was all good work, but it was done in 2002 and 2003. And so for the last 6 months, TRADOC has been leading us through a complete reevaluation of our force structure. We have the right size, the right designs, the right mix of forces. And we'll be actually wrapping that up, and so I think we'll be well postured to know how we should address our force to maintain the balance that we have built. R4 Gen, Army Force Generation, something we've been working on hard since 2005. It got a bad reputation coming out of the gates. Good concept, but when you're deploying 1 year out, 1 year back, about 150, 160,000 soldiers, there's just no way that we could execute it with the size force we had. At a 1 to 2 that we'll start here the 1st of October, we can execute it at a sustainable pace and a sustainable tempo. And that's a huge step forward because R4 Gen is a fundamentally different way of building readiness for both the active, the Guard, and the Reserve. And it's a much more efficient and effective way of building readiness, and I think it's going to serve us well as we go into the future here. The other thing that I would tell you that R4 Gen does, it allows us finally to establish a link between resources, end strength, tempo, and output. For this much money and this size Army at this bog dwell, this is the output that you get. That's critically important to us because we cannot allow ourselves to go back and accept an Army that is not designed to yield at least 1 year out, 2 years back for the force. We cannot allow ourselves to go back less than that. And our goal has to remain getting to 1 year out, 3 years back for the active force. And lastly, strategic flexibility. I mean, if you add all of those things up, increasing the size of the Army, increasing the dwell, organizational change, getting us on a rotational model, it's all about restoring strategic flexibility. And as we have more soldiers home for longer periods of time, they will begin to be able to train for things other than Iraq and Afghanistan. We had our first full spectrum rotation against the hybrid threat down at the Joint Readiness Training Center a couple of months ago. We'll have our first one at the National Training Center in August. And we'll only continue to increase those numbers. So we're about 18 months away from being able to deploy trained and ready forces out of the next available force pool. And that's something we haven't been able to do, again, for 5 or 6 years. It's a much, much better position for the country to be in strategically. So we're not in a bad place to begin looking at this transition into sustaining that balance in a period of declining resources. One of the things that I'm going to continue to say as I go out the door here and remind folks is the war's not over. And we know the budget has to come down. We know that we need to be more efficient in how we execute, but we have to be very, very careful that we don't inadvertently hollow out the force as we're trying to reduce the resources. I think that would be a huge, huge mistake for all of us. But as we look ahead now into the next decade, you know, what are our challenges? And as I've looked at this and thought about this, I believe our challenges will be, one, to maintain the combat edge in this force. Do not underestimate the benefits and the impact of having a combat seasoned force. Down at the Joint Readiness Training Center, I watched some of the operations down there. No doubt we were a little rusty on some of the battalion and brigade staff synchronization skills. But when those platoons and companies closed with the enemy, they were absolutely lethal. And there's a lot of goodness in that. But how do we sustain that? How do we continue to challenge and make it interesting for these great young warriors? While we're doing that, we have to reconstitute the force. So while we're fighting, we're reconstituting. And we're recovering from, as I said, a decade of war and transformation. And those will sometimes be conflicting priorities. And then the third thing, and it's also maybe a conflicting priority, is that we have to deal with the impacts of the last decade at war. So let me just talk about those three things for a second. Maintaining that combat edge. As I look forward, I believe the most important element that we need to build into our force is versatility. Because the one thing we know about the future is we never get it exactly right. And with modularity, we've taken a huge step toward being able to put together versatile force packages to deal with different challenges. We need to carry that over into our equipment, into our training, and into our leader development. On the modernization side, we have worked very hard to build an affordable modernization strategy. We have to have that. We cannot afford everything. We cannot resource every good idea. I tell the military leaders as I go out and about, it's like, and there's enough military people here that might work. You know, you ever had 2 battalions in the same motor pool? You know, concertina wire down the middle, guy with a radio and a pickaxe handle, pacing back and forth, making sure nobody rips anybody off. Meanwhile, they're stealing and blind from behind them. And then one day, the general comes down and says, "Good news, 110. The new motor pool is ready, move out." You know, 110 is gone by sunset. What does 112 do? Spreads out, right? XO brings his I Love Me stuff down from the order room, hangs it in the motor pool. Tam Skirk's got his own desk, 2 bays for each company. Tan's got a service bay, wheel line, track line, trailer line. Sport platoon's got their own area. Life is really good for 112. And then about 6 months later, the same general comes back. And he says, "Bad news, 112, we got to put another battalion in this motor pool." What does 112 say? No way. There is no way you could ever put 2 battalions in this motor pool. Well, there's folks out there that think there's no way we could ever exist without everything that we think we need. And we can't. And I believe Bob Lennox has done a wonderful job of helping us make resource-informed decisions that will give us best value in how we allocate our procurement dollars and give us more capability into the force. I heard Bill talk about the network. That is the centerpiece of what we're doing, because when you think about versatility, no matter where you are on the spectrum of conflict, you need to know where you are. You need to know where your buddy is. You need to know where the enemy is. And when you shoot at him, you need to hit him. And that's all empowered by the network. And we're going to start seeing the Jitters family of radios start coming out next year, and we're going to see the reality of what we know we need to achieve. We're a little spoiled by the fiber optic networks that we're operating off in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was one of the great lessons from 382 down at Joint Readiness Training Center. He said, General, you can't jump fiber optics. Took them a few days to get even the rudimentary elements of a network up and going. We have to be able to build this network and take it with us wherever we go. The other element maintaining that combat edge is full spectrum training. And quite candidly, we published that doctrine in 2008, but we've never had the opportunity to practice it, or rarely had the opportunity to practice it in any place but Iraq or Afghanistan. We're just starting to do that. And the more we practice it, the more we're going to inform ourselves on whether that's right and how we need to adapt and adjust it. And it's only going to be good. And lastly, under the combat edge, we have to make sure that the reserve components are resourced and utilized in a way that allows them to maintain the combat edge that they have built over the last decade. Half of our Guard and Reserve are combat veterans. And we have reduced the training time from brigade-sized units from 180 days to 66. That's a huge accomplishment. And that will be one of the main things that we've got to work our way through as we go forward here. So maintaining the combat edge. Reconstitution. Two parts of that. One is the continuous reset of units and soldiers redeploying from theater. We have to continue to get their equipment and put it back in a serviceable condition so that they're prepared for whatever comes next. And that's going to be an ongoing process. But the larger issue is what I call restoring strategic flexibility. We have to build readiness in the next to deploy forces so that we have the capability to hedge against unexpected contingencies without going into the available pool, without affecting operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as the equipment comes out of Iraq and ultimately comes out of Afghanistan, it's got to go through the depots and then get back into the units. And this will take us a couple of 3 years after the conclusion of operations. But it's absolutely essential. And it's something that we ought to all keep our eye on. Because once the money for that starts going away, it's the beginning of hollowing. And I'm kind of looking at that as the canary in the mine shaft. And then lastly, we have to deal with the challenges of a decade at war. I mean, think about it. We've lost over 4,000 soldiers. They've left over 20,000 family members. We've had over 25,000 soldiers wounded, over 8,000 of them badly enough to require long-term care. We've had over 100,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war diagnosed with traumatic brain injury. Fortunately, over 90% of those are mild to moderate. We've had over 40,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. We've processed over 30,000 soldiers through our warrior transition units. We cannot take our eye off of the ball in terms of our commitment to continue to support those that have been affected by this war. And so all of those three things are going to have to take place at the same time. And while we're working and training hard to maintain that combat edge, we're reconstituting ourselves and building the resilience into the force for the long haul. Now, with that as prologue, let me just put up one slide. And I don't know if they've shown this yet, but this is the fiscal reality that we're dealing with. Oh, I see, it's over there. Oh, down, yeah, but if I point it down front, you can't see what I'm pointing. All right, here we go. I'm going to have to do this descriptively. Here's 2001. Basically, a decade and then a second decade. The blue is the base program. The green is the OCO, the contingency operation budget. And you can see how it's changed. About $78 billion here, all the way up to a high of around 250. And as you look at this, of the $1.7 billion that we have received in the last decade, we've got the large mass of it, $1 trillion in the last 4 years. This right side represents the program that we just put out there, the 1216 program. And you can see that we get about half of the money that we're going to get in the next decade in the first 4 years. And as I look at this, you look at the base going out, that represents zero real growth. And my view is that's the best we're going to do. Now, I do think as long as we have forces continued deployed, we're going to get OCO money to support them. But in the base, I think zero real growth is the best we're going to do. And if you look at the history of our budgets and defense budgets, it's peaks and valleys. And so the reality is we're probably going to see something on the right-hand side that looks more like the left-hand side. That's the reality that we're dealing with. But the other thing I'd point out to you, it's still double what we had a decade ago. And I don't remember going around with a tin cup in 2001 looking for money. My recollection was we had a pretty good Army in 2001. So that's the challenge. And we've been working hard at it for at least 3 years because this is very predictable. You know, sometimes we manage to convince ourselves that this isn't going to happen. But if you go back and look at the history since World War I, it's very symmetrical. You remember the old curve in the training manual, the Band of Excellence? It is almost that symmetrical. And there is no question that we are on the downside of a peak. And those troughs normally go for about a decade before they start coming up. All right? That's the fiscal reality that we have to have in our heads. And I've been sending generals to business school down at University of North Carolina for 3 years because we saw this coming. And so that they can get in their head that managing resources and coming up with innovative ways to do things more efficiently is flag officer business. And it's warrior business. And as a result of that investment in time and effort, we were able to meet the efficiencies and reductions called for by the SecDef without having to reduce force structure until 2015. Because I felt that if we had to reduce our force structure before we'd had a chance to get the soldiers a couple of years at home, that would have been a deal breaker. So there's a lot we can do here to help ourselves, and it's important that we do. Now, let me mention one other thing I think you're going to hear about here in a second that is also going to help us here, particularly in our investment accounts. And about 9 months ago, the Secretary asked Gil Decker and Lou Wagner to do a study of our acquisition process. I mean, candidly, coming out of the Future Combat Systems program, we recognized that we had some challenges. And we asked them to take a soup-to-nuts look at our acquisition processes, from people, from requirements, to just how we do our business, and to give us a blueprint to fix it. Because if that doesn't tell you we have to be hugely efficient to get the most value out of our acquisition dollars, I don't know what does. And so they have done us a great service. And they have prepared a report I think they're going to talk to you on here a little bit. But no surprise, and some of you have seen this, but our requirements and acquisition core competencies have atrophied over the last 2 decades. And there's no fault here. I mean, the interesting thing, the anomaly is we've got the best equipped Army we've had in decades. But at the same time, we're not prepared for that. And so they've given us some recommendations on how to make our requirements, processes, more collaborative and more resource informed. They've given us some thoughts about how to better manage risk, and they've given us some thoughts about how to better grow our acquisition workforce. And Mal, you may not know this yet, but as I was leaving yesterday, the secretary showed me the tasker coming to you to take this and come back with an implementation plan in 60 days. So we're moving out, and on behalf of me and the secretary, I haven't had a chance to say this publicly, but Lou and Gil, thanks very much for the great work you did on that. Now, let me wrap up here, and then I'll take some questions. We're at a key transition point from getting us back in balance into transitioning to a mindset that says, how do we sustain that balance in a period of declining resources? We got a great Army, but it's still stretched and recovering from the last decade at war. And it continues to prosecute a war in 2 theaters. So my message as I go out in those 5 posture hearings is going to be, it took us a decade to get where we are. We recognize that we must be more efficient, and we are working hard at that, and we'll continue to work hard at that. But we're at war, and this war isn't over. So be careful. Be careful, because the last thing we want to do is hollow out this Army while we're fighting a war. And some of you have heard me say this, but I called Shai Meyer right when I got into the job. I said, Shai, what happened? Tell me what happened. How did the Army get hollowed out? And he says, what happens is it's incremental. There's not one big thing that happens. There's not one big budget cut that happens. It's little things that happen over a period of time. You know, he went to Congress in 1980 and said the Army was hollow. Now, Shai was a very thoughtful guy. He had the good sense to go to Camp David and tell the president he was going to do that the weekend before. But that was 8 years after the last combat battalion left Vietnam. And so what we have to be careful of is that a series of incremental cuts doesn't put us in a position 8 to 10 years from now where we turn around and said, what the heck happened? And you've all been to Washington and you understand that can happen. So that's my message going out. Be very, very careful as we look to do what we rightfully should do, reduce resources allocated to defense, but we've got to do it in a very thoughtful and careful way so we don't hollow out this force in the middle of a war. And with that, I would just close by saying it has been the greatest honor and a privilege of my career and frankly my life to have led the men and women of the United States Army over the last decade of war. And I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss you all. But thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.